Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today, I'm going to tell you a baffling story written right here about a man we'll call Gabe. And this story will highlight how horrible personal finance and bad investing habits, coupled with sheer stupidity and a lack of planning, can lead to disastrous results and the squandering of $1 million by a man who is pretty much set for life. So, let's start this story. Now, this story begins with the unfortunate and unexpected passing of Gabe's father. At this point in the story, Gabe is 34 years old, and his mother had passed away when he was quite young. So up until this point, Gabe was raised by his father. And Gabe and his father had a very good relationship, although they did live quite far from each other. Gabe's father was a bread and butter blue-collar man. He grew up and worked all his life in Detroit, Michigan, working many different jobs at many different times in his life in the auto industry. And over those 40 years, Gabe's father, Joseph, had done pretty well for himself. He wasn't rich by nowadays standards, but his hard work and very down-to-earth attitude had allowed him to always make money and to always save money. Gabe, on the other hand, lived in California. He moved there right when he turned 20 to pursue a degree in business. And while it started off good, California and the beaches and the pretty girls got to him. And a bachelor's degree, which usually takes on average a little more than 4 years, and if you really try, maybe a little less than 4 years, took him 8 years. He took less classes than a full load, changed degree directions, and took a couple of semesters off. With that said, he was always working, and he was always making a little bit of money, and he did finally complete his degree at 28 years old. Now, fast forward 6 years, and Gabe is 34, and he had worked his way up to an assistant manager position at a privately owned but still relatively large real estate development company, which means Gabe was able to live a decent life, making around $63,000 per year. With that said, this is California we're talking about, and $63,000 doesn't go as far there as it would elsewhere. So Gabe didn't really own a house, and he always split rent for a 2-bedroom apartment or a condo or of sorts with a roommate. And while Gabe lived a good life, he had always dreamed of more. He had always wanted a house. He had always wanted a sports car. He had always wanted the California life that was shown to him on the movies, not the realistic California life that he was living. And as you will see, this desire for more, which was in stark contrast to his father's frugal attitude, would set in motion the events that would lead to the squandering of what can only be called life-changing money. And this is the point where the story takes a darker turn. Gabe's father, Joseph's death, was unexpected and sudden, and it extremely impacted Gabe. Gabe visited his father probably 4 to 5 times every single year, and his father came to visit him probably 3 to 4 times every single year. Not only were they father and son, but they were best friends. While very different, living through the loss of their mother and trying to continue with a smile on their face, they grew close through the years. So when Joseph passed suddenly, Gabe was shook to his core. He was deeply saddened, and it took a serious toll on his happiness for many months. One other thing happened to Gabe. His monetary situation changed in an instant. Through the grief of dealing with his father's passing, Gabe also had to figure out what to do with his newfound wealth of $1 million. His father had done well, and his unexpected passing meant that all the money he had saved for retirement hadn't been touched. One house fully paid for, worth about $300,000. $500,000 in various investment and cash accounts. A work truck worth about $40,000. Various watches, jewelry, and other valuables worth about $10,000. $50,000 worth of gold. That, put together with many other belongings like household items, yard work machinery, and a few bonds, and Gabe was left with close to $1 million. This was quite literally life-changing money, and if managed correctly, Gabe could have been virtually guaranteed an extremely good retirement. All he had to do was manage it correctly. Unfortunately, this is not what would happen. But for the first year, he did nothing. He was devastated. He was heartbroken. and he missed his best friend and his father. Sadly, though, year 2 is where things financially start to crumble. At this point in the story, Gabe had started to recover mentally. He was able to pick up the pieces, and with the help of his work friends and plenty of drinking, he got through the loss and was finally starting to feel better. Unfortunately, as the pain subsided, the realization of the massive amount of wealth he now had started to sink in. And unfortunately, this was the beginning of what can only be called massive, unnecessary, and wasteful spending. Gabe lived in California, and up until this point, he had lived in rooms, apartments, and condos always rented and always shared with someone else. And Gabe had always had a dream of one day owning a place of his own. The idea of a place truly being his had always appealed to him greatly. And sadly, Gabe would use this pain of loss to justify the first purchase in a chain of money-destroying events. A house. Gabe wanted a house, a place to mourn the loss of his father. In peace, he justified to himself. A place to call his own, something he deserved after such a traumatic event. At least, that's what he told himself. Now, a house, fine. A place to call his own, fine. Not a bad investment, to be honest. The problem, Gabe had always dreamed of a movie-like California life, so he didn't just buy any house. He didn't buy a small 1,000-square-foot house, which could have been logical and smart since he was single. No, he bought a 2,900-square-foot home in a very nice part of town. And he bought it cash, $500,000. Now, mind you, while Gabe was in California, he didn't live in Los Angeles or San Francisco. So while $500,000 nowadays buys you like a shoebox, especially in places like Los Angeles, 5 years ago, outside of the major city centers, he could have gotten a much less expensive, smaller house just for himself. Now, how did he pull this off in the first place? Well, he sold his father's Michigan home, his childhood home. No point in keeping a place that he's just going to get sad at, he thought to himself. He used the proceeds plus the sale of most of the physical belongings to pay for the much larger house in California. And unfortunately, while maybe purchasing a house, even an unnecessarily large one, may be seen as an investment and justified, it only gets worse from here. The first year he had lived in his house, it had been nothing but a dream. He loved it. And so did his friends. They barbecued every single weekend, it felt like, and when summer arrived, a particularly warm summer, Gabe realized two things. One, the house's AC system was old, original, 19 years old, and it was highly undersized. And two, that he really wanted a pool. These barbecues were nice, but the sweltering California heat was borderline unbearable in the early afternoons, especially in his south-facing backyard. So, why not? Why not put a pool? He had the f***ing money to do so, and that he didn't even expect to have a little over a couple of years ago. Plus, to him, a pool was an investment, he thought. It only adds value. Yeah, well, according to the data, while it does add value, it almost never adds more value than it costs. And in some cases, it can actually detract from curb appeal because, newsflash, a pool is a luxury and a yearly expense. But to Gabe, it was an investment, an $87,000 investment, my goodness. And don't forget the new AC system. Put together, he was in for about $100,000. And instead of taking a loan, which he could have paid off with his stable job, in which now he was making close to $70,000, he decided to pay it cash because he was always raised to pay things in cash from his father, who was frugal. And honestly, as someone with a finance degree, I feel like I just have to say this. Cash is not always the best option. And without getting too far off topic, simply put, if you can get a loan for less than you can generate safely from investing, then paying for something in cash is not always as cut and dry as the best option. And in cases like this, where Gabe was in the middle of his earning years, it could very well be argued that a loan may have been better and that he should have left the remaining $500,000 alone. And that's without even touching the fact that the pool in the first place was probably not a good financial investment, as it is a luxury purchase. If you're going to buy a house and you want a pool, you should buy a house that already has a pool. Whatever, I digress. The point is, another $100,000 was eviscerated, mostly on a pool, by the end of the third year. And that's before taking into account property taxes. Something Gabe had never had to pay before because he always rented. Which Gabe quickly learned meant that from now on, every year, even though he owned the house outright, he would owe about $6,000 on his tax bill that had to be paid. And tragically, or honestly, just stupidly, year 4 wasn't any better. A boat and a sports car. That's what Gabe bought with inheritance money in year 4. My God. Why? Well, I'll tell you his reasoning and his justification, and then you can tell me if it were wise or stupid. His reasoning? He had always dreamt of owning a BMW M3. Ever since he was a teenager, each new generation of an M3 that came out, he wanted to own badly. He had posters of them on his wall growing up. He had even rented a last generation M3 on a road trip a few years ago, and he loved it. But at his decent but not crazy salary, he had kind of come to terms with the fact that he would probably never own one. Well, things were different now, at least in his mind. Gabe had money in the bank, and you really only live once. And you don't take it with you when you go. My goodness. And his justification? A celebration of a promotion at work. His company was throwing him a small celebration dinner because he had just been promoted to manager, which luckily came with a pay bump to around $80,000 and a very small piece of company ownership. But it was a very small piece of company ownership and really more so like a token. The point is, he wanted to show off to himself and to everyone at work. So he did something so fucking stupid, so dumb, so fucking stupid. He bought a fully loaded, newest generation M3 with inheritance money. He didn't lease it, as you probably should, luxury cars. And again, this is another tangent, but when leasing versus buying, if you are going to get a luxury car, this is one of the scenarios where leasing might just make more sense. You're not married to the car. If something breaks, it's in warranty. And because honestly, luxury cars, especially performance cars, break much more often than economy cars. So honestly, this is one of the instances where leasing might just make more sense. Anyways, another tangent. He didn't lease it, and he didn't buy used to save him a ton of depreciation cost. He bought brand f***ing spanking new, $103,000. My goodness. Now, before I get to the f***ing boat, let me say this. Yes, a lot of his purchases are not total losses. The house will appreciate, but it's not brand new, it's 19 years old, which means it will need maintenance. The pool will add value, but for the first few years, not as much as it's going to cost. And the car will absolutely depreciate. But even that will be worth something in 3 to 5 years. These things are not total losses. They're just stupid financial purchases. Gabe is spending like he inherited 5 times as much money. And even then, some of these things are hard to justify. Like the next thing. How do you justify buying a fucking boat on $1 million of inheritance after already spending $700,000 of it in just a few years? I don't fucking know. But that's what he did. He bought a boat. Well, really, he bought a boat and 2 jet skis for a whopping $50,000. This gives me a headache. This gives me a headache reading this. And the reason and justification, according to Gabe, he lived near a lake, and it was his birthday. Now, I want to clarify something to you. Gabe, now looking back, does understand that basically all of these purchases were unnecessary. But honestly, to me, I don't really think he does, and I'll tell you why in a second. But before we do that, let's just recap. At this point, Gabe's bought a house, installed a pool, installed a new AC, which is probably the only reasonable purchase so far. He's bought a sports car, he's bought a boat, and he's bought 2 jet skis for a whopping total of $750,000, all cash, all from his $1 million inheritance. And guess what you need to tow a boat? A truck. Finally, in my opinion, something makes sense. Through all the madness, Gabe did something that I can finally maybe sort of agree with. He bought a truck used. At least this is something in the right direction. For about $27,000, the problem is he bought this truck only because he owned a boat and he needed to tow it. Ending year 4 with just under $780,000 of inheritance spent on things he really didn't need. At this point in the story, you might be saying, well, at least he has a stable job and he's probably saving some money, right? Well, yeah, kind of. He has a decent job, but he lives in one of the most expensive states in the country, and he has taxes to pay on his income, and he also now has taxes to pay on his property. He also has utility bills, and he drives a ton for work, which means he has a high gasoline bill and a pretty high restaurant bill from eating out during work. So yes, he's saving some money, but it's not as much as you might think. And honestly, that's not the point. The point is his father, his best friend, basically set him up for life. If he had just managed it correctly, he would be set up for life. His father's passing could have been some sort of silver lining to a sad situation. It could have been the start of him investing or buying cash-producing assets or literally anything else. Instead, in year 5, he just has over 20% remaining of the initial inheritance. And all he's done is added a ton of new bills, which in essence virtually cancel out any pay raise he's gotten in the last few years. Now, to me, the last $200,000, in my opinion, will be gone before we know it. Why? Well, it ties into what I said earlier. I don't think Gabe actually realizes that his insane spending has been wasteful and honestly just stupid. Because to this day, he hasn't sold any of it. He hasn't sold the boat. He hasn't sold the jet skis or the truck or the M3. He hasn't downsized, and he doesn't have any plans to do so. Now, without being able to predict the future, I can't tell you how long the last $200,000 will last him. All I can say is he's wasted a golden opportunity to set himself up for life, bestowed upon him by his father, who was very much frugal. And at this point, all I can do is beg, implore him, call for him to please invest the rest in anything, in a market tracking ETF, in a high yield savings account, in bonds, literally anything. $200,000 invested at 34 years old can still turn into something amazing by the time of retirement, if it's just actually invested. But seeing the path that he's taken over the last 5 years, unfortunately, I highly doubt that will happen.